Let us go to Great Britain, where Grace Jackson is standing by. She is co-host of the Literary Hangover podcast. I'm going to call her an expert on history and fiction and China as far as this show goes. I know that embarrasses her, but as far as I'm concerned, she's an expert. And we're going to talk about America's policy of strategic ambiguity and revisit America's relationship with Taiwan and the One China policy. Welcome back, Grace Jackson.
Thank you.
Well, do you mind if I ask you a question about your parliament?
Oh, go ahead. I'll try to answer.
What is tractor porn?
How come
apparently, there is a fetish of British schoolboys who look at farm equipment.
Oh,
that's not why you came on the show. Let us talk about strategic ambiguity. This is much more titillating. Strategic ambiguity. Is America, I know that when Reagan was president, he deployed the madman theory. Like, the guy's crazy. You don't know what he's going to do. Biden is deploying strategic ambiguity. What the hell does that mean?
Well, Biden himself isn't deploying. I don't think he's deploying much, but strategic ambiguity is a kind of pillar of US policy towards Taiwan, and it's something that arose out of the Cold War. But I was thinking about strategic ambiguity this week because of the kind of increasingly unambiguous stance that the US is taking vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. Basically, it seems like we're getting closer and closer to a straight-up admission that America's aims are to weaken Russia as opposed to kind of bring the war to an end or to kind of help to move towards peace. And there seems to be a kind of less and less ambiguity in the position. But strategic ambiguity is really important when it comes to US-Taiwan relations and US-China relations, because it's the phrase that we use to define the way the US has interacted with Taiwan ever since 1979, when it formally recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as China as such. Prior to that, the US had recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan, which is the kind of name that was given to the Republic of China on Taiwan. So in 1979, after Nixon and Kissinger had kind of been working on it for many years, since 1971, normalization with the PRC happened, and the US had to kind of come up with a way of maintaining some kind of connection with Taiwan, and also having some ambiguity around whether it would come to Taiwan's defense in the event that the PRC attacked Taiwan or tried to kind of unilaterally unify with Taiwan using military means. And so this is a very important phrase. There's a lot of talk in the media at the moment that the US government is kind of chipping away at strategic ambiguity with Taiwan because there have been more high-level kind of connections being made between the US government and Taiwan. There was a sort of group of congressmen and senators who visited Taiwan last month, including, I think, Lindsey Graham. So there is more of that happening. And yet there is still a huge question mark over how much the US would intervene. Would it intervene at all? Would it be more of what we're seeing with Ukraine, which is that the US would provide heavy weaponry? It already sells a lot of arms to Taiwan. And the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed in 1979, allows for that. It allows for the US to provide Taiwan with weapons of a defensive character in order to kind of maintain peace, to maintain the status quo across the strait. And something I wanted to mention, because in 1979, this didn't happen in a vacuum. Obviously, this was a result of the US needing to do something about the fact that it was kind of not going to recognize Taiwan anymore. Taiwan lost its seat at the UN. But something that people don't often talk about in relation to this, and something that I have not even been thinking about that much until recently, is that in 1979, China invaded Vietnam. Now, this is important because China's image on the world stage, or the image that it has projected quite successfully on the world stage, is one of a uniquely peaceful country that takes a principled stance on intervention. It doesn't intervene in other countries' domestic affairs. It certainly doesn't go gallivanting around the world like America. And this is something that's very important to the way China projects its power, and its diplomatic power especially. And yet, yes, China has waged an aggressive war in the past 50 years.
Why did they invade Vietnam, and how did it go for them?
It was horrible for both sides. It was sort of like not really won. China kind of said that, okay, we've done what we came to do. After a few months, they said the gate of Hanoi is open, we're going to go back. But it was very bloody, huge losses on both sides. Now, the reason that it happened in the first place, and this is fascinating. So at that point, Deng Xiaoping was the premier. Mao had been dead for 3 years. Mao died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping was sort of consolidating his power and launching his reform and opening up policies. So how he was reforming the Chinese economy, opening up to the West, allowing some marketization of the Chinese economy. And when Deng Xiaoping visited the US in 1979, he met with Jimmy Carter, and he said that of Vietnam, he said, the child is getting naughty. It's time he got spanked. He said, if you don't teach them some necessary lessons, it just won't do. Now, there's a whole background behind this, and it has to do with the Sino-Soviet split, which happened around 1960 and kind of persisted. But China's stated reason for attacking Vietnam was to get Vietnam to leave Cambodia, to relieve pressure on the Khmer Rouge, because China was allied with the Khmer Rouge at that point. And Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union. And
Right.
And was making...
Pol Pot was the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge being Pol Pot.
Pol Pot, exactly. And yeah, Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union. And at that point, of course, as I've just said, America was beginning to make overtures, or had made overtures to the US. And so the US and China were kind of getting closer. And there was a lot of tension along China's northern border with the Soviet Union at this point. The Soviet Union had amassed troops on China's northern border, so it was threatening its security. And China, and I thought this was cute, China also cited the mistreatment of Vietnam's ethnic Chinese minority as part of its justification for invasion, which, of course, we've heard that before, that's something that feels very 2022. And I'm not going to kind of litigate whether that was a real justification or not, but I just thought it was interesting how there were several reasons given, mostly to do with this alliance with the Khmer Rouge and the background of the split with the Soviets. But it certainly it adds some color, I guess, to this picture that China projects of itself as uniquely peaceful. Now, I'm not saying that I think China has done a lot less damage on the world stage than, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, but just to say that it's not strictly true that China has never intervened beyond its borders. And in fact, it had me thinking that we're so obsessed right now, and understandably so, with the comparison between Taiwan and Ukraine, as a victim of a larger kind of power and sort of revanchist claims to territory. But I think in a way, the Sino-Vietnamese conflict of 1979 it kind of provides more food for thought, I think, as an analogy to what Russia is doing in Ukraine at the moment. The difference being it was short. It took a couple of months. It wasn't won decisively. And as Deng Xiaoping said to Jimmy Carter, it was basically a slap on the wrist to Vietnam. Although that's definitely underplaying it. It's interesting that it's called the Chinese side called it the self-defensive counterattack against Vietnam, which is again, like these terms are so paradoxical, just like this strategic ambiguity, which contains within it so many contradictions.
About 3 weeks ago, you were talking about an article you had read where the writer was saying there doesn't have to be a conflict between America and China, that basically war is not a constant in nature, and we don't have to go to war with these countries just because China is growing economically. Are most of these wars about strategic interests? And if so, what is America's strategic interest in China? Is it oil? Is it nutmeg? Is it tea, opium? Well, probably opium, but what is our strategic interest other than our allies, our alliances?
You mean the reason why the US is not content to allow China to rise, you mean?
Yeah, what does a strong and powerful China, what does that bode for America?
Well, I think the sort of foreign policy blob, as it were, and I think this is true in both China and the US to an extent, they see foreign relations as a zero-sum game. Right. That if China is winning, that must mean that America is losing. And there may be some truth to that.
That's how I view show business. Your success is my failure, but I'm a lunatic. This is lunacy to think that way.
Right. But there's a whole history of ideological competition as well, which is underpinning this relationship, and mutual suspicion, mutual admiration on both sides. I've also, I read a pretty interesting book a few years ago about the history of US-China relations. It's called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, I think, by John Pomfret. And he makes the case that China and the US are essentially doppelgangers. They're like evil twins or something. And they've always had this special connection, but they've also always had this rivalry, distrust, suspicion, and yet a mutual attraction as well. And it has to do with the nature of being a great power. And China has also thrived in the world that the US made. In the post-war period, China has done very well from the global order. And I think the US probably feels a little bit annoyed about that, that this country has managed to do so well with so little, with so little space given to it by the US. So I think it's complicated. It's not just about resources, though. It's not just about, you've got this and I want it, or a particular sea route. It's a whole history of rivalry and competition.
It's a hard sell to the American people that China or Putin is going to storm into America and colonize us. That's a hard sell. We're seeing how hard it is in Ukraine for Russia to colonize Ukraine, how hard it was in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Korea. It's really hard to physically occupy another country militarily. So these wars, it's really hollow to scare us. I don't think it works anymore. You can't say first it's Moldova, then it's Estonia, and next thing you know, it's Brooklyn. I just don't see Americans buying that with Putin. I think you have to now elevate this battle and explain to the American people why we're fighting. What are we really fighting for? What is it? Why is America so afraid of Vladimir Putin that it would? I mean, he invaded Ukraine. Would you agree that he invaded Ukraine because it was America? It was NATO and America encroaching on Russian territory? That seems.
I agree that he was baited. I don't agree that that means he's not culpable or accountable. I think he had a choice, but he was baited. There's no doubt.
And he's wreaked havoc, through the internet, and there's no question that he's a menace. But there are ways to deal with menaces other than weaponry and war. So what is the threat that China and Russia pose to America other than Russia flexing its muscle in Eastern Europe and China surpassing us as the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases? What do we have to fear from China?
Well, I mean, the people in Washington would say you have to fear an authoritarian axis, which is threatening to democracies around the world. I'm not saying that I buy that as such, but there's a certain amount of ideological common ground, I would say, but they're not the same. I think America just fears a loss of hegemony around the world. It fears a loss of power. This isn't necessarily a traditional kind of territorial issue as such for America. It's not like it's more to do with, I don't know how to formulate this properly. But I think ultimately to kind of create the conditions for peace, and this is why I wanted to bring it back to strategic ambiguity, this concept of ambiguity. Mm-hmm. Peace is ambiguous. Like, it's fragile, it's ambiguous, and it can be disturbed by like a single word in a single treaty. So, for example, in the Shanghai Communique of 1972, which began the process of normalization between the US and China, the US and China agreed that, well, this is where the one China policy comes from. And I think it's really interesting and says a lot about how fragile and how kind of nuanced all of this stuff is. So in this communique, the US said that it acknowledged the Chinese position that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China, right? This is what the PRC put forward. Now, for China, that means that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China. That's its position now, that Taiwan is a part of China and should be unified with China. However, the US, that's what is called the One China principle. And China, the PRC government, has a One China principle. The US has a One China policy. And the One China policy is simply that the US says, we acknowledge that you think that. We acknowledge that that's your position, basically. And this was put into writing in English, but both sides created their own version, their own translation. And at the very last minute, after it had been agreed, the Chinese side changed the translation in Chinese from a word which kind of has connotations of like understanding. This is a translation of the word acknowledgement, right? They changed the word to one that has a stronger association of acceptance. And so you had this little change that meant so much and that has allowed China to say, oh, America actually does recognize our position. And actually, the English version, which is the binding version for the US policy, it says simply that we acknowledge that China has this position. And I think it's amazing. It's such an absurd, weird little episode in diplomatic history, but the amount of weight that one word bears for world peace is extraordinary. And I just think, to finish on this note, I think ambiguity is very important, and it's not ideal. It can lead to disagreements, but it's the kind of fabric of the status quo, at least in East Asia at the moment.
Right. There are people who enjoy war. There are soldiers who miss it, generals who enjoy fighting it. Right? There's a nobility to war.
Yeah, I mean, I gather that's the case. It's a whole industry as well. It's a huge part of the economy. And without it, who knows?
We could actually live better lives. Grace Jackson, thank you. Great job. What a privilege it is to have.
I'm sorry. I hope I didn't go too off topic for you there, David.
No, are you kidding? I didn't like your position on tractor porn. I found that to be American. I think Henry Wallace is rolling over in his grave. Grace Jackson is co-host of the Literary Hangover podcast with Matt Leck, and she comes to us from Great Britain, and you can follow her on Twitter at Grace Jackson. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you next time.
Yes, next week. More.
Okay.
More. Thank you. More.